it's a question for Mansueto and Anu. Mansueto talked about the role of crisis in triggering these processes of creating local economic development. And I remember a few years ago, we presented the preliminary findings of this latest Brazil project in the World Bank in Brazil. And at the end they said, this is very interesting, but we can go out there saying that you need crisis in order to get local economic development. And in some sense, I wanted to know from you, since then, what have you been, what did you find in terms of understanding, what is the actual mechanism that is behind like these crises that actually triggers these new agreements? Because I think fundamentally we're talking about rearranging local agreements about formality or informality. For some reason there's a first moment in which you have these like stable agreement, let's say like in the devil's deal, there is in some sense a common agreement that everyone should stay informed. For some reason something happens, there's an opportunity to found these agreements and an opportunity to make them in different terms. So I was wondering, from the cases that you described, what do you think are the actual drivers of these? So that we can go beyond saying that, oh yeah, it's actually crises that promote change.
Yes, it's true. Even in the Ghanaian case, there was a crisis, actually, which I didn't mention, there was a crisis of revenue. And the government was under huge pressure because it had just taken a loan from the IMF because under financial crisis. And it needed, as a result of some agreements, to actually raise revenues. And the only place where, it had already done the large taxpayer reforms, etc. It couldn't really go much further down that route. It had to generate some revenue from the informal economy. And the tax agency itself was undergoing reforms by creating an autonomous agency and then bringing the tax agency closer to the taxpayers, etc. So the crisis was an issue. But what's interesting is that the opportunity that the crisis created was to engage with the associations. They didn't, like in other places, we looked at some examples later on based on secondary literature. In Peru, for example, a similar financial crisis pushed tax agencies to try and go and enforce and collect taxes from individual informal sector firms, and it didn't work because they didn't go to the business associations or the associations of those firms. So yes, we can't create crisis, but then once you have it, what are the opportunities to engage in the institutions that actually exist? I mean, I think that's the lesson I would take away from that.
Yeah, I think I would say something very similar. I mean, when I mean crisis, sometimes it's not natural, the drive is not natural causes. Sometimes the crisis is made by, by the way that enforcement agencies work. In one of my cases in Toritama, you had this problem of pollution that became worse and worse because the productions of the cluster went up very fast during 3 or 4 years, and then the laundries in that place didn't care for the environmental impact of the laundry of the jeans. But then, because the production increased, the problem of pollution increased, and then attracted the unexpected, the unexpected attraction of the news. And people started to show, in magazines, in newspapers, in TV, about the problem of pollution in the city, Toritama, in the countryside of Pernambuco, that nobody knows about it. And then you had this state attorney that went there and decide, this state attorney first tried to talk with the firms, showing that you need to control for the pollution, and firms didn't care. And then the state attorney decided, okay, he shut down, he ordered to close down all the firms in the city, and then he took a 1-week vacation. And then when he came back, everybody wanted to negotiate, to sit on the table with him. So the kind of crisis was man-made, but it was a kind of, it was a means to induce, to bring these people to the table and start to solving the problem. And I think that's it. You don't have, not always you have to wait for the crisis, but sometimes, until the crisis comes, you not change the rules. And the best example is what happened here in this country with the financial regulation. If you look back 3-4 years ago, financial regulation in the United States was a kind of benchmark for the world. And then proved it, there was failed. There was, with a lot of problems. But until the crisis came, everybody thought it's a terrific regulation. You don't have to do anything to change the system. And you needed a crisis to show that, oh no, it doesn't work, you have to move, you have to change all the way we regulate the financial sector. So sometimes it doesn't mean that you have always to wait for a crisis, but sometimes crisis, it's what we call blessing in disguise. That's a term that comes from Albert Hirschman, from the 1970s, that I learned with Judith. And but I think we agree on that sometimes the crisis can be made by the role of the public agencies work in enforcing the law. But the point is that looking to crisis and look to enforcement not as an end in itself, but as a means, to bring the actors to the table and try to solve this collective action problems.
Short point. Roberto and I recently wrote an article together, and we, a couple of days ago, coming here, we're discussing what should we do together next. So, this is very obvious, but it hadn't occurred to me before, that the people we studied, the prosecutors, and Ronaldo is here, not to let me lie alone, or the labor inspectors, or the environmental inspectors, they are walking crises. Wherever they go, that's where the crisis goes, for the people who they visit. That's an emergency. And imagine a prosecutor shows up at your door, that's a crisis. So, in a sense, what we're studying is, we are holding the crisis constant. But in some cases it works, but in other cases it doesn't. So maybe we should go back to our field notes and make that our next project.
I would echo that in a sense that, it's a lot of Judith's work, and before that, Hirschman's work has also been looking to see how you can embed pressures around a project or an attempt to intervene or do something so that you induce outcomes that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So looking at that is certainly seeing crisis as an opportunity, ongoing opportunity. Other questions?